Okay, so thank you all for coming. My name is Hala and I'm the treasurer of the Pre-Law Society. I'm going to go ahead and get this thing started. This is the Affording Law School presentation, tips on how to pay for law school. Just a screen. Okay, so here we have a presentation outline that highlights some important topics we're going to go over. We're going to start off with a brief introduction and then move into estimating available resources, where we're going to talk about savings, need-based scholarships, merit-based scholarships, and work study. We're going to then talk about estimating in-school expenses, where we're going to talk about tuition, fees, housing, living expenses, all of that good stuff. And then finally, we're going to move on to deciding how much you need to borrow and making sure you borrow the right amount, where we're going to talk about student loans and loan forgiveness. We're going to end it with some final words and questions, but as we get through these sections right here, I'll take a pause for questions. But if you do have any questions as we're going along, feel free to drop that in the chat, and I'll try to answer that as we go. Okay, so I want to start off this presentation by asking you guys what field of law you're interested in. So if you guys can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves if you'd like, can get some examples. So we have corporate law. I'm also interested in corporate law, immigration, civil rights, criminal, alternate dispute, okay. Civil rights, immigration. Okay, so family law. So we'll have a lot of diversity in the fields of law. This is great. Thank you guys for sharing. Okay, so why am I asking you this? I'm asking you this because depending on the field of law you're interested in, salaries can differ greatly. You want to ask yourself, are the costs worth the degree? So I have an example here that shows the difference in average starting salaries of a corporate lawyer and a criminal lawyer for 2021. As you can see at the top, the corporate lawyer has an average starting salary of about $98,000, whereas a criminal lawyer has an average starting salary of about $51,000. So let's assume that they both attended the same law school and graduated with $150,000 in debt. The corporate lawyer, starting off with a salary of about $98,000, probably found the debt more worth it than the criminal lawyer, starting off with a salary of about half as much. With that said, it's important to consider and compare these two components so you can make the smartest financial decision for yourself. On to the next slide. Now we're going to move on to estimating available resources and get into more details. Make this bigger. Okay, so have you started saving? Start now. Savings are a great source of funds. Letting people in as we're going. Sorry about that. Savings are a great source of funds. If you have the intention of going to law school in the near future, start setting aside money for it now. With that in mind, keep in mind that savings don't usually cover a high percentage of your debt. Because of the high cost of attending law school, savings are typically not enough to cover all the expenses of your education. However, savings can be a great source for the smaller fees that you might have to pay, and also books. So again, saving will never harm you. How much to save? If you're working, it's encouraged to save at least 20% of your paycheck. If you can save more, that's even better. So based on a survey, 45% of millennials do not have a savings account and don't know how to start. So millennials are between 25 and 40 years old. So to think that this age group don't have a savings account and don't even know how to start, we definitely don't want to follow in their footsteps. That's why I'm going to continue to emphasize that the earlier you start saving and learning how to save, the better off you'll be in the future. Okay, so some of you may not know how to open a savings account, so I linked an article by TJ Porter through bankrate.com that explains how to get started very well. It uses very plain and clear language, so it's very understandable. I highly recommend coming back to the slide and reading this article if you want to open a savings account and get started with saving if you haven't already. See some questions in the chat. We'll get to that in a second. So now we're going to move on to financial aid, need-based scholarships specifically. So what should you know about this? Grants in general, both merit-based and need-based, don't have to be paid back. So if you get one, it's not something that you're going to pay back or be required to pay back in any way, shape, or form. Most scholarships are typically not need-based. Grants offered through law schools are typically merit-based, but not always, so they can be need-based at times. With that said, for need-based scholarships, the FAFSA application is essential. Complete the free application for federal student aid by visiting fafsa.ed.gov. Okay, so FAFSA, when should you apply? Complete your FAFSA as early as possible. You can begin filling out the application on October 1st of the year you plan on applying. When is the deadline? The FAFSA is typically open until June 30th of the next year. With that said, just keep in mind that you should stay up to date with these deadlines, because although they've been pretty consistent the last few years, things could change. So you definitely don't want to miss it. So again, stay up to date with all these deadlines. And you can find all the information again at fafsa.ed.gov. Anything financial aid related. Okay, so to move on to merit-based scholarships. Merit-based scholarship, what should I know? Scholarships are an excellent way to help law school students pay for their education. Law schools typically offer scholarships and consider students for them through the standard application. So there's no separate application that you need to apply for to be considered. Having a strong academic record will give you a greater chance of being selected for a scholarship. So how can I receive a scholarship through a law school? To receive a merit scholarship, there are two significant components for consideration, your GPA and LSAT score. So for your GPA, you want to maintain a strong GPA through your years at the university. Reach out to professors and take advantage of tutoring resources if needed. Don't slack off in the beginning or the end of the semester. Your grades are really important, and again, your GPA is one of the greatest components that is going to get you considered for a merit scholarship, which could cover a great amount or the full amount of your tuition for law school. The second component, the LSAT score, you want to prepare early for it if you want to receive a high score. We have many resources available for students in preparation for the test. We went over this briefly at the GBM towards the end of the presentation, where we talked about a few of the resources we have. So if you missed that, definitely go back to that presentation and check out the resources we do have available, and email us if you have any questions, or you could drop it in the chat if you have a quick question right now. So with that said, after considering this information, take a look at the median GPA and LSAT score for law schools. If you place at or above the 75th percentile for both categories, you're likely to get a scholarship at that school. So merit scholarships are going to be the greatest factor that could save you money for law school. So make sure you keep the GPA up and your LSAT score high. A lot of emphasis on that. Okay, so here's some information on scholarships found on the University of Virginia Law School website. This information obviously varies depending on the law school, but I think it gives you a general sense about the difference between merit scholarships and need-based scholarships and how law schools look at it. So I'm just gonna read through what they have to say about merit scholarships first. It says a number of merit-only scholarships are awarded to entering students each year. The value of merit scholarships may range from $5,000 to full tuition. All admitted applicants will be considered for merit-based scholarships and no separate application is required. So what you can take from that is that merit scholarships are going to save you a lot of money. So just at UVA, and I think most places they offer up to full tuition. So again, your academics are really important for that. And then another important thing that they mentioned here, again, is that there's no separate application usually. It's just through your standard law application where they look at your GPA and LSAT score. For need-based scholarships, it says need-based aid at the University of Virginia School of Law consists primarily of student loans. Pending availability of funds, need-based scholarships may be awarded. All admitted applicants who wish to be considered for scholarships and which demonstrated need is a component must file the free application for federal student aid. So another two good points brought up here. Again, like I said before, need-based scholarships are not as common, but they can be offered at times, which they stated here. And then something else that's really important is that you have to file the FAFSA in order to be considered. So again, staying on top of those deadlines and applying early is going to be your best bet for that. Gonna skip a few slides here and go to this one. Oh, Professor Fortime, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just a quick thought about these scholarships. So note, if you're going with a need-based scholarship, you're still applying for FAFSA, so you really need to apply for FAFSA. With regard to merit-based scholarships, schools actually vary in terms of the scores in which they will measure in terms of deciding whether to give you scholarship. We had folks over last year from a number of recruiters came. We asked them these questions in terms of how they're giving financial aid. And generally speaking, if you beat the mean with regard to GPA and LSAT scores, you are likely to get some kind of financial aid. Now, it might not be a lot of financial aid, but there'll be some. That said, 20, 30 years ago, nobody was really getting scholarship support. Now more people are getting scholarship support because overall law schools have been facing declining enrollment. So this is actually a really good time to get some financial assistance and get merit-based scholarships. But merit-based scholarships require that you get a good GPA and a good LSAT score, which is why while you're a four-year student, you really want to do well with regard to your GPA and eventually your LSAT. The GPA you have tremendous control over. The LSAT, you can study for, but generally speaking, it's a one or two shot deal. One of the concerns that I personally have with regard to need-based scholarships is that generally speaking, need-based scholarships are just one more tool in the arsenal that law schools have to recruit good candidates. And right now we're getting a lot of good candidates going to law school. So if you have a student who's coming in and the person can receive a need-based scholarship or a merit-based scholarship, and the need-based scholarship might be not just because of financial issues, but because of some other concern that the university has, it's possible that the need-based scholarship, which as a student is just as good as anything else, might be targeted towards certain people so that they could free up merit-based scholarships to go to other students. So be mindful. If you're going to be applying to law schools, you might be trying to go for a need-based scholarship, but trying to maximize your chances to get a merit-based scholarship is probably the better strategy to follow. Then that will be it for me.
Thank you, Professor Fortime. You made some really great points. So thank you for sharing. So on this slide, I have some statistics of the percentage of students who received grants at 2 universities in Virginia. 48.3% of full-time students at the University of Virginia received grants in 2020, and 84.5% of full-time students at George Mason University, their law school, obviously, received grants in 2020. So these are fairly large percentages. So again, do your best to achieve high academic scores so that you can be considered for one. Because again, these numbers are fairly large, even for UVA law being like tier 14. That's about 50% of students receiving grants is, great. So definitely keep those scores up and meet the deadlines. So I'm going to go back to a few slides that I skipped. So here are some other great sources for scholarships. LSAC.org offers a variety of scholarships. Each have different requirements for eligibility and vary in amounts up to $15,000 as of right now. It may have changed. And then down below, there's also links to other great sources for scholarships as well. So you guys can definitely come back here and check that out. Okay, so this slide is really important. I linked a very important article that discusses how law schools offer scholarships contingent upon maintaining a certain GPA. So to summarize, some law schools will lure students in by offering a grant or scholarship that is contingent upon one's ability to maintain a certain GPA throughout their years of studying. The problem with this is that in most cases, there are only a number of students who are able to maintain that certain GPA because law schools typically grade on a curve. With that said, many students find themselves in severe school debt as a result of losing their grant. If there's one thing you should definitely go back to, it's this article. This was information that I didn't know and you guys are probably not aware of, but we definitely don't want to be put in the same situation that some of these students were in, going into their first year of law school, thinking they have a scholarship and that they can maintain that GPA, and then later realizing it's harder than it looks, and it's not as easy as it seems, and losing their scholarship and ending up in debt that they didn't think they would be in. So again, very important article. I would highly recommend coming back to this slide and reading it fully. Oh, Professor. Mhm.
Yeah, this issue has received a lot of attention over the last 10 years or so, whereas law schools were kind of doing this bait and switch. They basically say, come to the school, we'll give you generous financial aid in your first year and promise you to do this over 3 years, provided that you're able to maintain your GPA. But just like what happens at DCU, if you've got bad semester grades, they're going to have a lingering effect on your possibilities going forward. To a certain extent, law schools have become very receptive to this, and they've been trying to change their policies. But with regard to your application process, it's a good idea to try to negotiate for a scholarship. But also be aware of a couple of things. One, you want to know where the grade point average is in that school in terms of how competitive it is. And you also have to take notice of your circumstances. Even if you did really well at a four-year college like DCU or any other four-year college, when you go to law school, you're dealing with another group of candidates and you're facing a new bell-shaped curve. So you might have been top of the curve at DCU, but you might shift down on that curve when you get to that other school. So this becomes something very much of great concern. That said, chances are if you get some kind of a merit-based scholarship, your first year is going to be covered, so that's a plus. Focus heavily on doing well in your first year, and you should be able to ride through this through the next couple of years as well. So be mindful of your strategies.
Thank you for that. Okay, so work-study programs are another good source for saving in law school. Work-study programs are funded by financial aid. You have to file the FAFSA to be eligible. And another requirement is that you have to be a US citizen or permanent resident to be considered for this. So some key notes about work-study programs. They provide meaningful work experience. Work-study programs can be a great source of funds to help bear the expenses of law school and to create a memorable work experience. Law school websites will have any additional required forms, so visit the website of the law school you're applying to ensure there are no additional forms required for work-study programs. To clarify that a little bit, this is really important because sometimes not only do law schools require you to file for the FAFSA to be considered for a work-study program, but they have additional forms or an additional form on their website that has to be submitted as well. So again, checking your website or calling the admissions office to make sure that there's no extra step that you needed to take is gonna serve you the best to ensure that you have an opportunity to be a part of this work-study program. Another last point, quick point about work-study programs is that students receive their funds through weekly paycheck. So it's fairly similar to undergrad work-study as far as like steps and this information. Okay, so before we move on to estimating in-school expenses, does anyone have any questions about anything we just talked about? So merit scholarships, need-based scholarships, savings. I'm gonna look at the chat.
As Hal is looking at the chat, let me just make a quick comment. It's fairly common for law students to work while they're in law school. Usually by your second year, you're looking for some kind of legal work, and it's not unusual to get a job working as a clerk or as a paralegal or something else part-time. That said, one of the most important things you should do when you're in law school in your first year is concentrate on doing the best you can. So much of your post-law school career will depend on how you do in your first year. It will set up if you're going to be on law review, if you're going to do moot court. It's going to determine your chances to get a nice summer associate position the following year. So you really want to score well in your first year. That said, if you are going to work, you want to look for some kind of job that's not necessarily going to contradict or get in the way of your legal studies. When I was a law student, I had a number of friends who were working part-time. I worked part-time. I worked in the restaurant business. My friends worked in the restaurant business. If you know how to work as a waiter or a waitress, you can make some serious cash on the weekends when otherwise you'd probably be taking it easy. And at the same time, it won't necessarily get in the way of much of your schoolwork. So be mindful of trying to work and trying to support yourself. I can say this honestly, and you'll probably get more of this if you attend Belinda Snyder's presentation in a couple of weeks, where we have some VCU alumni coming back and telling us about their law school experience. Most of them will probably tell you that law school is brutal. Most people aren't getting more than 5 or 6 hours a night of sleep. So you want to really focus on trying to get the best you can out of the law school experience in your first year. So be very careful about trying to spend too much time working to support yourself, at least during that first year.
Okay, so it looks like we don't have any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to estimating in-school expenses. So you always want to consider the tuition, fees, supplies, etc. of a law school. To the left, you see a screenshot of the cost of attendance at the University of Richmond as an example. You should be able to find this information, the cost of attendance, on any law school's website. So for the University of Richmond, their tuition is $48,000, and they have their other estimated costs listed below. It's also important to consider location, housing, and living expenses of a law school. Compare cost of living before selecting a law school to attend. Take a look at the law school's website and compare things such as living expenses, housing, etc. Consider saving where you can. Every amount you can save from law school expenses will help you in the future. Weigh your options and make the best decision. Okay, so on this slide, I have the cost of attendance for the University of Richmond, resident versus non-resident. So the cost of attendance for residents and non-residents typically don't differ by a great amount for law school, unlike undergrad school. You can see that the cost for tuition and fees at UVA is $65,500, while for a non-resident, it's $68,500, so about a $3,000 difference, which isn't that much when you're looking at it overall. So again, it's not like undergraduate school, like many of you might not be aware of or not thought about. I'm gonna go back to this slide, and I just want to go through another point and kind of emphasize it. So over here, when I'm talking about living expenses, housing, all that stuff, for the University of Richmond, it looks like their room, board, utilities are about $12,000. And then go back to the University of Virginia, and it's about $18,000. Again, from school to school, from law school to law school, living expenses can, there can be a big difference between them. Like, for example, NYU, I think their living expenses are about $25,000, $26,000. So you're already going to be paying tuition. It's important to at least consider living expenses as well. If you can save money for living expenses, and not even considering all the extra expenses you're going to have to pay on top of that, transportation, food, everything like that. It's something to keep in mind. And, I don't know if Professor, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, one thing about some of the scholarship support that we've talked about with regard to the grants, often the grants and the scholarship support will go to offsetting tuition costs. And that can be huge. And most of the costs here are going to be tuition costs of one way or another. But they rarely will actually go to actually covering other types of living expenses, housing costs, food, books, and things like that. So be mindful. Even if you get some financial grants, you're still going to be out of pocket quite a bit of money. So having money on the side can be incredibly helpful. I cannot tell you how many law students I knew when I was in law school who were living on ramen noodles and macaroni and cheese because they couldn't afford anything else. So be mindful. This is going to be a tough couple of years. You're probably not going to be living a rather lavish lifestyle while you're in law school.
Thank you for that, Professor. So again, I just wanted to emphasize that point in case it wasn't clear. Gonna move. Does anyone have any questions before we move on? Let me check the chat. Okay, so Noreen asked, how should students go about negotiating scholarships? Who should students talk to? Professor, I know that you're familiar with this. Do you want to answer that question for me?
Yeah, to a certain extent, I'm a bit familiar with this. Normally, what the law schools are doing when they're offering you scholarship and scholarship support is they're trying to boost their numbers. All the law schools want to increase their standings with regard to GPA and LSAT and be more attractive in terms of the ranking systems of law schools. So they want to move up the scores. The lower ranked schools are trying to get on the board. Higher ranked schools may be very competitive and they want the best people. And somewhere in the middle, they're trying to move up their scores to be seen as being more competitive and more attractive schools. And the way they get that is by that negotiation. Now, when I went to law school back in the 90s, because I'm ancient, it was almost unheard of to ask for this type of financial aid. And if you actually engaged in the process of asking them and said, hey, look, I'm interested in going to your school, but can you throw me a little cheese to help me go? And they'd say, sorry, no, good luck, go to someplace else if you can't afford us, you cheap bastard. But now that's changed. Law schools have become increasingly competitive in trying to draw candidates in. So when they send you an offer, they may send you an offer with some kind of scholarship assistance, but you may get multiple offers. And I don't think there's anything wrong with contacting the admissions officers and saying, hey, look, I really appreciate your offer. Thank you for doing so. I've been offered admission someplace else, and they're throwing me a generous hunk of cheese. Can you match or can you offer some support in that situation as well? So don't be reluctant, I think, to negotiate. To a certain extent, law school fees has become a little bit like buying a car. You know, the ticket price is not necessarily what you have to pay for it, but you won't know how you're going to do until you start negotiating. So by all means, get involved with it and get involved with it early, and don't be afraid to discuss the admissions person when it comes in. When you get your acceptance letter, look at the acceptance letters that you're receiving and take a look at the financial assistance. And if you need some financial support or you want some financial support, don't be afraid to ask. They might say no, but unless you ask, you're not going to get anything. So by all means, definitely negotiate about doing it. And you can speak directly to the admissions office and they'll be responsive to it.
Okay, so thank you, Professor, again. So now we're going to move on. Let me see if there's another. Okay, thank you. Okay, so after comparing tuition, fees, housing, living expenses of law school, you need to decide how much you need to borrow and make sure you borrow the right amount. So student loans is the next thing we're going to talk about. Okay, so you always want to be aware of the type of loan you take out. Do your research and make sure to take out the loan best suited for you. Comparing fees, interest rates, and repayment options are essential before taking out a loan. And you always want to look out for these things. So here's some common points to compare before selecting a student loan. We have interest rates, processing fees, loan amount, security requested, etc. All these things you should definitely consider and compare between the loans that are offered to you or that you're looking at before deciding which one you want to take. Here are some popular law school loans this year. We have the federal subsidized and unsubsidized loan, which is through financial aid, I believe. The federal Grad Plus loan, some private loans as well. And if you research these individually, I think you can find more information about them. But again, these are just the most popular loans, I believe as far as 2020, not 2021. Okay, so $145,000 is the average law school debt in 2020. So the average length of repayment for law school loans is about 10 years. And this is usually because the standard repayment plans are usually 10 years. You can defer this if necessary, but your loans will grow. See, does anyone have any questions about that before I move on to loan forgiveness?
Let me just simply add that student loan debt can be quite enormous. $145,000 is not unusual if you're buying a house and you need a mortgage for a house. But $145,000 that you're paying in 10% with an interest rate that's likely to be higher can be pretty tough. And don't forget that you cannot get rid of that loan or that debt if you file personal bankruptcy. That was taken off the possibility list a few years ago because the government realized that there were way too many students who had student loan debt. So these student loans can be remarkably high and they will stay with you for a long time. So you do want to liquidate them as fast as possible. If you can think about how much money you're going to be earning, I would highly encourage you to think about what would be a 7% student loan at a debt of about $150,000. And anybody looking it up can check it out. And then the repayment over 10 years, and then try to figure out how much you're going to be paying out of pocket each month. And if you're spending about $5,000 to $10,000, and I think that would probably be too much, but if you're spending about $3,000 or $4,000 a month paying off a student debt, then you're talking about $36,000 out of your pocket every year that you're paying to the bank before you actually think about your quality of life. So if you're only making $50,000 or $60,000 a year and you're paying off the student debt, and that student debt is costing you $20,000 to $30,000, you realize your quality of life is not going to be great as you're paying off that big bill. So be mindful of that. Many ways, this question in terms of how much student debt you carry will have significant impacts, not just in terms of what your legal career is going to look like, but also probably in terms of what law schools you're going to end up choosing. But I'm going to get ahead of myself on that, and I'll let Hala speak to some of those issues.
Okay, thank you for that. So again, I really like how Professor Fortheim again emphasized that you really want to consider, and we talked about this in the beginning, you know, think about the field, not only the field of law you want to go into, but the law school you're interested in, and you know, looking at the starting salary of that law school, looking at the average starting salary for the field of law you're interested in, and then comparing that to your tuition costs, and then how much you're going to have to take out in a loan. If you receive if you receive a merit scholarship or not, you know, you can consider both of those aspects, and seeing, you know, after graduation, once you know, get a job, are the costs worth the degree, like we mentioned in the beginning. And everyone's on a different path and has different goals. So, you know, what's worth it for someone else might not be worth it for another person. So again, doing your own, I'll highlight this at the end, we're almost done, but doing your own individual research and further research on things specific to you is so important. I'm going to move on to loan forgiveness. What does it offer? It offers a forgivable loan to assist students in repaying debts. These types of programs are commonly made available to public interest lawyers. Commonly, not always, but that's the way it usually is. I have some loan forgiveness programs, examples of them over here. We have the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, Federal Perkins Loans Cancellation Program, and a few others. Now keep in mind, each have different requirements for eligibility and usually come with quite a few contingencies. One that I saw between, that was fairly similar between them, is that you do have to work for, you know, a specific business or, you know, corporation for a certain amount of years. And that's in addition to a bunch of other requirements. If you actually are interested in one or want to see what one's about, I would suggest, you know, researching them individually, and you should be able to find that information. Professor, do you have anything to add on loan forgiveness that I didn't mention?
No, I'm sorry. I was actually looking at some calculations in terms of how much a loan for 10 years would cost if it's about $150,000 a year. And the numbers we came up to was about $1,700 per month, or roughly $20,000 a year. And that's before taxes. So be mindful. Those student loans can be pretty heavy each year as you proceed. But as far as loan forgiveness programs, there are lots of loan forgiveness programs out there in terms of working for the government. providing some level of public service. Often public service programs will offer different types of loan forgiveness programs. My wife worked for Central Virginia Legal, she still works for Central Virginia Legal Aid Society. They have a loan forgiveness program, but they only forgive about $3,000 of student loan per year, at least when she joined. So there is some variation in terms of what your employers are going to provide for you. So be mindful of that. If you do need to borrow, exhaust the federal loans first, because the interest rates will be lower and the terms will be kinder. So that would be my general advice when it comes to loan forgiveness.
Okay, thank you for that. We are going to end it off with some final tips to keep in mind. Law school is a big decision. Make sure you're ready. Have you ever heard someone say that going to law school was the worst decision of their life? They probably said this because they didn't consider the fact that law school is a great investment of not only your time, but your money. So you want to be certain that this is the path you want to go before committing to anything. Keeping a high GPA and strong LSAT score. These two components are essential for scholarships, like mentioned previously. Having a strong academic record will only help you. Finally, do your research and take advantage of resources. It's important to do your own research on things such as loans, grants, scholarships, etc., so that you'll be able to take advantage of all the opportunities provided to you. Although this presentation highlighted some important things about affording law school in a general sense, doing further research specific to your needs and interests, for example, the field of law or specific law school you're interested in, is recommended and highly encouraged, like I talked about previously. Professor, did you have any final thoughts you wanted to throw in there?
Yeah, just a couple thoughts. If you guys have any questions, by all means, feel free to email me. I'll try to give you an answer to the best I can. Choosing where you go to law school really matters in terms of how much debt you're likely to get. If you go, and a lot of that will determine what kind of career you're likely to achieve. Now, I've had students in the past that basically said that if I don't get into a top 20 school, is it worth it? Well, it kind of depends on what you want to do and what you want to achieve in life. You can make quite a bit of money doing law, and you don't necessarily have to go to a top 20 school. And you can have a very rewarding life as an attorney without necessarily getting into a lifetime of debt, right? My wife and I, she is a public service lawyer. I'm a college professor. We both have a decent quality of life. Debts are not killing us right now. So it is possible to move through this if you finance it well. But one thing to be mindful of, how you decide to approach this issue is going to be very important with what's going to happen after law school. So knowing what you're getting into before you actually do it is hugely helpful. And planning so that you can mitigate the cost of this can also be helpful moving forward. Personally, I wouldn't necessarily think that the cost of law school itself should be a detriment to going to law school. If you want this, if you love this, if this is what you want to do with your life, then go do it. But if you're uncertain, realize that if you are pursuing law school because it just looks like something good to do after college, take some time, think about the financial costs, and realize that this is probably going to be carried in your life for the foreseeable future after law school. And that could be really problematic for you. Definitely, it should have an impact on the law schools you choose. I'll be around to answer any questions as well if you have any.
Perfect. So I have a little bit of financial inspiration, a good quote that I like: an investment in knowledge pays the best interest. So we'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch with us through any of these platforms. We have our email address, our Instagram and Facebook. If you don't follow us on Instagram or don't have us on Facebook, make sure you go and add us. So before I open up for any questions, I just want to note that this presentation will be sent out via email. If you're signed up with us through Rams Connect, I think you should be receiving the email. If not, try to sign up with us, but it will also be found in our Instagram bio. So thank you guys. Let me see if we have a chat. Okay, that was Professor Freud's time. Okay, great. And then before, you guys can be thinking about questions. I don't know if anyone has any, but this was our first event of the semester, not including GBM. So this is my event. Our next event is on February 25th. It's hosted by Sarah, our vice president, and her event is breaking breaking into the legal force, paralegal and entry jobs. So it's at 7:30 as well. So if you guys are interested, definitely come out to that. We have a lot of exciting events for the Pre-Law Society, and we'd love to have you all there. And again, thank you all for coming. We can take questions if anyone has any, but otherwise, this is the end of the presentation, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yes, actually, Isha, I have a thought about shadowing lawyers and getting legal internships. That's something that we've actually been kind of interested in doing and trying to get some support from the alumni on that. That requires a lot of personal outreach to actually make those connections work. That said, the courts have fantastic internship opportunities and they're very receptive. Now, the problem with internships, generally speaking, is that most of the lawyer organizations, the legal organizations, would prefer law students than undergraduates, simply because law students have at least 1 year of legal experience under their belt. But that doesn't mean that there isn't opportunities to shadow lawyers and get to know lawyers. So that's a big plus. One great opportunity, I think, for future lawyers is to volunteer at the court. You can go to almost any district courthouse in Virginia and talk to the clerk there about internship opportunities, and chances are the clerk will speak to you about this and create an opportunity. Many of the programs at VCU will give you credit if you do an internship opportunity, and I don't think that the actual work necessary to show is that significant. So you can get an easy 3 credits working at a local general district court. You'll see a lot of cases come back and forth. You'll see a lot of litigations. You'll see how the court works in the back room. And that can be a hugely decent experience for you if you want to proceed. There are other opportunities to shadow lawyers or get to hear about lawyers. We're going to continue trying to develop those types of connections in the future. But I would highly advise reaching out to the various NGOs in Richmond area like CVLAS or LAJC or the Virginia Poverty Institute, government organizations, and see about types of internship opportunities they offer. Most of them will be happy to speak to you at least, and there are often many opportunities that you can probably tap into.
Okay, so we're getting some things in the chat. Nadar said, not sure if it was already mentioned, came a bit late, but public schools oftentimes have much better tuition rates, 20,000, 30,000 than private rates. Sample 65,000 UVA. So that's true, Professor.
No, that's true. And in fact, Hala and I were talking about William & Mary, which as far as schools go is fairly reasonable in terms of the types of tuition costs that William & Mary expects. And William & Mary is an excellent law school, and it's fairly close, which makes it kind of nice. I think it's cheaper than UVA. One thing to be mindful of, and you can find this information if you check out U.S. News and World Report. I can make that information available to you from 2018. Is that one of the problems for the William & Mary students is that their starting salaries on average tends to be less than some of the private schools. So if you had gone to, a better private school, let's say Georgetown, for instance, and you're making $160,000 a year, then that $95,000 to $100,000 that the William & Mary kids are going to be getting is going to be, well, significant. But realize that William & Mary is providing lawyers who do something different. Many of them are more local attorneys. Many of them are going to serve government functions. Many of them are going to look for a career in the public sector. Georgetown folks are going to become captains of industry and go to Wall Street. So it's a different world, and it's a different community that you're trying to address. So be mindful of that as well. Different law schools create different opportunities, but you're right. Sometimes public law schools can be very, very cheap. Used to be that if you went out of state, if you went to Tennessee, for instance, law school tuitions there could be remarkably cheap. So, I mean, if you want to leave the state and get a job in Memphis and you're thinking about going to, a law school out of state in Tennessee, that might be an option for you as well. Those public school tuition rates can be remarkably low. But where you go to law school partially determines your career prospects. And while you might want to stay in Memphis and it might be worthwhile to go to a school like University of Tennessee, you've got to decide what you want to do with your life, and if that works for you, that counts. So take that into consideration as well. Different schools create different career trajectories to a certain extent, so that should factor into your decisions as well. But definitely public schools are usually cheaper than the private schools, and in some cases the public schools like UVA is as competitive as with any private school out there.
So thank you for that question. Arnell asked another question. When considering schools out of state, is it possible for schools to pay for your relocation, or should that be something you start saving for? I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, but usually they cover up to full tuition, and you're responsible for the living expenses. So I would say
That,
the answer to that is no.
yeah, my assumption would be probably not. It's unlikely that anybody will pay you for your relocation expenses. And a lot of that, that's an interesting issue, and part of that comes down to what law schools you get into and what your choices are. If you're going to a top tier school, then you're probably not going to get any support for relocation expenses, but you're going to a top tier school, so you could probably pay for it out of pocket. If you're going to a second tier school, you're probably going to be looking for a career that's more regionally located, and sometimes you can get great second tier schools in some pretty good locations. But I would be very surprised if anybody paid for relocation expenses under those circumstances either. So yeah, I wouldn't put too much stock in that.
Okay, so thank you for that question. Um, Kylie mentioned, or she asked a question about paralegal certification, and Olivia said that our Sarah's event is actually next week, and she's going to be going through a lot of that information. So again, if anyone has any questions about that, you should definitely attend her event next Thursday. It's going to be great.
Let me answer the question about the paralegal certification and experience before applying to law school. The law schools take a rather interesting perspective on this. And one of the reasons why we often don't see a pre-law program in terms of a curricular program at places like VCU is because law schools increasingly have taken an attitude that basically says, we want to train our lawyers to be lawyers, our students to be lawyers. We don't want people who are thinking they know what it is to be a lawyer to come to our school. So we want to mold them in a particular way. That's something that you hear a lot of. But based on my experience, again, going to St. John's in New York, a lot of people who go to law school have legal experience. A lot of them are former police officers. A lot of them have worked in legal aid offices. A lot of them work in legal departments of corporations. So the fact that they have this legal experience does not do them any real detriment. The law school is an education that rewards wisdom and experience. And more wisdom and experience with law, I think, is at the end of the day kind of beneficial because much of it is about knowing how to think like a lawyer. So is it a good thing to have a paralegal certificate? Well, I don't think it hurts you. And I actually think working for a few years as a paralegal can really be helpful before you make that big leap into becoming a lawyer, simply because it's good to know if this is really something you want to do with your life. Furthermore, you may find that a lot of the work that you get as a paralegal means you don't have to become a lawyer. Right? Paralegals can do just about most of the things that lawyers can do, except sign documents, advise clients, and appear in court before a judge representing those clients. And even then, there might be some exceptions. So, the paralegal career is a fantastic career, especially if you're not sure about law school and if you can't pay for law school. This is why the event that's being done next week, I think, is a great idea. So I'm really looking forward to hearing that one.
Thank you for that. Do we have any more questions? Don't see any right now. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, we're pretty much done here. Thank you all for coming again. If you have a question and want to stick around for a few minutes or ask your question, you can stay. Otherwise, again, thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you next week at Sarah's event. Next Thursday.
That was an excellent presentation.